We are Brok and Sindri, and that means you are listening to or watching Brok and Sindri games. And this is one of our very first videos.
Yep, so today we're going to be going over our personal top 5 favorite / most influential games. So these are our personal favorites. So it's just an opinion-based piece. If any of you disagree, feel free to comment on it. And with that, sit back and relax, and we'll get straight into it.
All right, so let's talk about our top 5 games of all time. Why don't we start with your number 5?
Okay, so my number 5 is kind of a recent pick from last year, actually, is God of War 4 for the PS4, obviously. I find that this game, it's probably one of the better games on this generation. I wouldn't put it in my top 3, but definitely I think it just made the top 5 at my number 5 slot because of the great storytelling, graphical fidelity, and just all of the gameplay mechanics that they managed to squeeze in on what I considered to be near the end of this generation's lifespan. They somehow managed to raise the bar even higher.
Yeah, I can't disagree with everything you said there. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic game. Easily the best one in their series, and I think possibly the best one on this generation. In terms of storytelling and everything they tried to accomplish, it was massive, and it didn't let me down at all.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can agree with that.
So what's your number 5 pick?
Well, so almost the same title, but actually slightly different. It's actually Gears of War, the original one.
Okay, yeah.
And you know, so the reasons for my pick, like graphically, it was pretty amazing as well. It's sort of that sort of browny grey tone, but it really fit the environment. It revolutionized a lot of stuff in gaming. I think it was on the Unreal Engine. It was the first time I actually played a game on the Unreal Engine, and just the way that they had put in the cover system, and like it was a good story. It was some good gruff characters, but it was just how cool you felt playing as like Marcus Phoenix, this just badass dude, and being able to like chainsaw aliens was pretty cool as well. So I just think the way they put those games together, for me, probably my favorite like shooting game, if you like out and out shooting game like ever.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think that it's one of the few where I'm genuinely kind of interested in the story behind like the locusts. Like I'm not I'm not too in depth in the Gears of War lore, but definitely like it's one of the few games where I'm kind of interested in the enemies that you're like mowing through with literal chainsaws on your guns. So
yeah, and you know, it's one of the few games I think in the world. There's a lot of games where you're like humans against like an alien or whatever, or that there's this post-apocalyptic world that it creates where there's not many people left.
yeah.
But there's not many games where you genuinely do feel it, and this is a game where you do feel it.
Yeah.
And I could easily talk about the others in the series because it's a really good series as well. But to suffice to say that like. You do. You're like Alpha Squad or Delta Squad. I can't remember which one now, but you're one of the squads, and you basically, you're desperate for men. Basically, you can't like, like you really do feel this world where the humans that are on this planet have been absolutely ravaged by this invading locust, and then later on when you start to hear more from like the Locust Queen. Like it's a really good villain, basically. Like it's really good. It's got everything that it needs, but I think for me it was more just the feeling and sort of revolutionizing the cover system and stuff. That's why it was so enjoyable.
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough call. I think out of all the shooter games, it's definitely one of the most interesting to me as well.
Yeah.
And I tend not to be into shooters, so.
Yeah, well, likewise. I mean, I could, like. I don't know if if we want to talk about honorable mentions, but I wanted to put a shooter in there because there has been like a lot of good ones. It's not my preferred genre, but when they get it right, they are fun. Like I could easily have talked about GoldenEye or Halo or some of those. But for me, the one that changed the game was Gears of War.
Yeah, I think GoldenEye must make it to a lot of top 10s.
Yeah, probably. And I think the one drawback for me on GoldenEye, one of the reasons why I probably didn't put it in is like I never had an N64 personally, so it was only reliant upon, if I was somewhere where we could play it elsewhere. And also, and this is not the game's fault, but the N64 controller was like, there's too much going on for me. It was like, it was too awkward.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd shape. Anyways, should we move on to number four?
Number four. Yep.
Okay, so my number 4 is a pick that I'm sure is on your list somewhere, but maybe not this low. So my number 4 is Fable: The Lost Chapters.
Okay.
Including Fable Anniversary, but that wasn't the greatest port of an older game. But I have played both, so
yeah.
Honestly, I think it's probably still one of the best RPGs ever made. Probably one of my favorite, as it's obviously on this list. I just enjoy the world building, the weapons, the magic spells, like just the fact that you can go from like literally a farm boy to basically whatever you want. You can become like, the pinnacle of good or the pinnacle of evil in, over the span of the game. And actual years go by in the game. Like you go from a young lad to an actual old man by the end. And it's some of the concepts in the game are very, they still have yet to be explored in the modern climate for games. And I don't know, I think a lot of them should be revisited in new titles.
I agree. I think, so yes, it is on my list. I'm not going to yet reveal where it hit on my list, but it is. And so I'll save some of what I've got to say for then. But something that I want to say about this one is really, it kind of achieved something quite special in my eyes where, even for the time, it wasn't the biggest RPG in terms of map. I mean, it had a lot of weapons. It had a lot of different armor choices, which a lot of them looked pretty similar. Let's be honest. So it wasn't like the most expansive game in the world. However, it was one of the most alive. Like each of the NPCs in there, like had their own like what I thought was great reactions to you. Depending on whether you were sort of more good or more evil. Like you could walk if you were like good and you had the halo and everything. You could like walk down, the streets if you like. And get cheered by the random locals, or if you were like evil and you had the flies hovering around you, you'd walk down the street and they would boo you or run away, or and just the way like when you could choose your name like as Chicken Chaser, and you could get like the NPCs going, Chicken Chaser, do you chase chickens? Like it's just little things like that just made this game like truly feel like even though it wasn't massive, it was everything you did affected everything that happened within the game, so I think number 4 is I can understand that. For me, yes, it is a little bit higher, and we'll get to that then, but yeah, I think it's a fantastic game. Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I sort of slightly missed when it was like coming out. I was a bit too young when it was first here, so it was sort of like I was sort of revisiting it almost when I actually played it. But without a doubt, it definitely deserves a spot in the top 5. Many of the systems that it includes just it should be revisited in newer RPG titles for sure.
Absolutely, I can agree with that. Okay.
So what about your number 4?
Okay, so my number 4 is I've had to put it in there. I couldn't say no because this is our favorite games. This isn't necessarily the best games, according to us. This is our favorite.
This is a personal list. This is opinion. So
absolutely. So this is actually the hardest spot for me in terms of my list, and you'll see why when we get to my top 3. There was a lot of that I could have put in at this number 4, but I've gone for Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. I just think that simply, like in simple terms, I think it's the greatest platform, game or side scroll or whatever you want to call them of all time. I've always been a fan of Crash over, any others. I mean, I know Mario and Sonic, but particularly Mario is well loved. I was never a big fan of Mario. It wasn't for me. And I think, out of all the Crash games, like Crash 2 was for me the one that just aced it. It just got it perfect. Everything it needs to do. Each boss level that was in there was perfect. It didn't try and overcomplicate the controls at this point. They'd added in like the slide or skid or whatever you want to call it from the first game. that was the only, like, pretty much the main extra bit, apart from like the body slam, like the or the belly flop, or whatever you want to call it. So there wasn't too much added extra, but it was enough to make it better than the first. With actually quite a respectable storyline for a platformer as well. And I just thought it was the soundtrack as well.
The Crash Bandicoot soundtrack is so iconic.
Yeah, I mean, like these missions, these levels where you're in like the sewers, and the music that they come up with in the sewers, like in particular, was one that always sticks in my mind. Yeah, and I could just never forget it. It's just I just find it fantastic, like just a fantastic game. And even to this day, when they re-released it with the Insane trilogy, it's something that you can still get hours and hours of great entertainment from. I think so. Yeah, for me, my number 4 has to be Crash Bandicoot 2, which I think is the best in the series.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that. I think it's, like, in my opinion, it's by far the best, like, 3D and 2D platformer, because obviously, like, parts of it you're sort of going left and right, but other parts you're going back and forward as well. So it's like, it was very revolutionary at the time, and also it's still super fun today. Like, I've played through the whole Insane trilogy. And it's just, it still ports pretty well to the current day as well. So I can't really disagree with you there. I think it's newfound success with the Insane trilogy hopefully means that we'll get more Crash related reboots in the
they've
future.
already announced this year, I believe, coming out is a reboot of the
Team Racing.
Which again, just quickly touching on, I mentioned about Mario, and like for me the best Mario games were Mario Kart. But for me, Crash Team Racing was always more fun and better than Mario Kart as well. Because again, it didn't try and overdo it. Like, they had good tracks, they had good characters. It wasn't like just ridiculous, in my opinion. And it was also on, obviously on a console that I had and that worked well, as opposed to like Wii or other Nintendos, which I'm I'm a gaming fan, but I'm not a big Nintendo fan. Sorry for everyone that just died a little bit inside when I said that, but. That's just me. So yeah, for me, like, as I said, there's others that I could have talked about, like Abe. The Oddworld games were really great back in the day. But yeah, Crash Bandicoot, and I think for me, that one is the best in the series.
Yeah, I think like with the Abe games, they're not quite as I don't know what the best word is, but I guess revolutionary as the Crash games. The Crash games sort of carved their own path, whereas the Abe games, while they did have some pretty unique systems, like controlling people's minds with farts and that sort of stuff, it was
and they also had the different they also did have the different like talking options as well, so they did try and incorporate a bit more. And again, this isn't a thing to talk about the Abe games at the moment, but just as a touching point on those, I didn't think they were platformers technically, but they were also like problem solving games.
There were more puzzle games, I'd definitely say.
Well, just to quickly say, I don't know if we're going to do too many honorable mentions, but I was so close to having Tomb Raider. The original Tomb Raider is my number 4. But I just think in terms of favorite, like, Crash is just so easy just to pick up and play whenever, and then come back, come in and out without, worrying so much. Which is why for me, number 4 on my favorite list. All right. I think that's enough about Crash. Do you want to go on to number 3?
Yeah, okay, so my number 3 is a specific game from a trilogy of 3, and it's definitely my favorite of the 3, this one being Mass Effect 2.
Okay. I think our lists are going to start looking pretty similar. So. Yeah,
so I would have put the whole trilogy if I could have, but obviously, Mass Effect 1 and Mass Effect 3 obviously get an honorable mention spot, but if I could only put one of the 3 on the list, it's definitely got to be Mass Effect 2, in my opinion.
Okay.
So multiple reasons. The main one being just the sheer intricacies of the squad building that you get in Mass Effect 2. The squad is the largest out of the 3 games, I believe. Larger than Mass Effect 3 as well.
Yes,
I think.
That's right.
Obviously, bigger isn't always better, but in this case, I think every single squad mate had a pretty interesting backstory at the very least. And they all came with their own loyalty missions where you could get them. Obviously, the whole trilogy has this, but the loyalty missions where you can, get them to fully trust you and work with you properly. And the whole story of Mass Effect 2 I found was extremely enjoyable after the roller coaster of the first game. Shit starts hitting the fan even more in this one. So Yeah, I couldn't not put it on the list. It's my favorite sci-fi universe, even more so than Star Wars or any of the others.
Yeah.
Mass Effect it deserved a spot on the top 5, 100%.
Absolutely. And look, I agree. I agree with everything you said, and it may or may not feature on my list soon, and therefore I may or may not have more to say soon. But
yeah,
I think that with the squad, something that you said about you have a lot a bigger squad than before, but there's almost like no wasted options.
It's not like it's just bigger for no reason. Like it's not just
right.
There's more squad mates than the first game to trump it. It's literally just every single squad mate was planned and pretty well executed, in my opinion. Even the DLC squad mates, Kasumi and Zaid, I think.
Yep.
Both had. I mean, I'd say Zaid was slightly weaker than some of the other squad mates, but it's still like both of them still had very enjoyable like side missions to go with them.
Agreed.
And if you don't like any of them, you can just leave them behind on the ship.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that's the other thing is there's so much so many other missions in this game.
Yeah.
That, you can easily use each one, a couple of times, even whilst maintaining your favorites, in terms of using them more than once. And I think, the other thing is this is a game that really warrants multiple playthroughs. But just to touch on those squad mates, I mean, this is one of the biggest things about Mass Effect. I mean, there's a great world, it's a good story, everything else. But what really gets you is that you start to care for these squad mates, even if you don't from the start. By the time you get to their loyalty mission, you might change your mind on them. I know for me, there was a couple of characters in Mass Effect 2 that I wasn't so keen on from when we picked them up. But then after doing the loyalty mission, like Jack, for example, I was kind of like, yeah, I'm not so fussed about her at the beginning. And then you do her loyalty mission, you find out about her past and what's happened to her, and then suddenly you realize, I'm like, okay, I'm down with Jack,
Yeah.
Well, Jacob as well. To be honest, he was quite boring until his loyalty mission, and then So yeah, for me, I don't think I've played or really played a game where you again, I mentioned Gears of War earlier. This is potentially one of them, but where you truly care about these squad mates, and it hurts you a little bit when they die, if they die.
Yeah. Well, I just think they're a little bit more than just squad mates as well. They often, they provide you like a new lens to see the rest of the in-game world with. So like
absolutely,
each of them has their own sort of view on the world and on other characters and other races and whatever.
Yeah.
And it sort of leads you to see the world through characters in the world's eyes rather than like your own.
I agree.
I think they're perfectly written.
and it's amazing that you say this. So like, obviously we've seen a spate of games like being turned into films or trying to turn into TV shows or whatever. And this is one that most people will say you can't do because of the amount of choice that you have in Mass Effect, but it's almost one of those ones where it doesn't really matter whether you choose female shepherd or male shepherd or however you play it, because the true sort of, not hero, but the true like characters are your squad mates rather than you.
Yeah, rather than you. Yeah, you're basically just the glue that gets them together to do the mission. Like
exactly. Yeah.
Anyway, that was definitely why it is my third pick on this list.
Okay.
Top three.
Yeah, I can see that. So my third pick would be, we mentioned it already, Fable Lost Chapters.
Yep.
Specifically. I mean, where do I start with this one? Basically, this was for me the first real RPG, with the exception of briefly Final Fantasy VII when I was probably a bit too young to appreciate what that was. But Fable was the first real RPG that I was playing and really got into. And in that sense, it's like a gateway RPG, like marijuana is a gateway drug type thing. It really set me down a path of going in, deeper and deeper into RPGs, and you'll see the rest of my list, and that will all make sense. But like I said before, it's one of those game worlds that might not be as big as Elder Scrolls or other games, but it felt just as alive, if not more so in cases. And I think that, again, the story was not exactly complicated, but it did exactly what it needed to. Again, your character, you don't get to have a name apart from a title that you can either purchase or earn. Otherwise you're called hero, or even when you're 66 and old, you get called boy by the guild master, and farm boy by Whisper, if you keep her alive, she still calls you farm boy, and there's all these kinds of things, and it's one of those games that, okay, with the exception of a couple of other games, on this particular list, there's not many games I've played through more times than this one.
Yeah.
Or put more hours into than this one. I really feel personally that if it wasn't for this game, like my whole gaming sort of experience since would have been so different. I just think it's one of those games that even today, if you played it now, it's not too dated. It still works now. As I said, it's pretty simple, but it does exactly what it does really well. And like there was a rival at the time, for example, Oblivion, Elder Scrolls 4, I think 4.
Yeah.
And it's funny. I had a couple of friends at the time. I was a teenager, and a couple of them said, "Oh, if you like Fable, then you'll absolutely love Oblivion." And they weren't wrong in the sense that when I played Oblivion, it was amazing. They did this massive thing right from the start. However, there were just times where it just felt a little bit more dead, even though it was much bigger in comparison to Fable. Like I said, there was something that I just used to love, even just standing still or doing like just messing around in like Bowerstone on Fable, just listening to the soundtrack and the background like ambient noise of people, which made it you just feel like you were like in this bustling sort of London style medieval like city almost, which I just thought was really cool. And then you can become mayor of that town as well, which was great too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was a lot that I loved. The combat for the time as well, which I thought was really good. Being able to mix up sort of ranged attacks with, spells or, like a bow and arrow or whatever. And then having like these amazing swords that you could sort of eventually get to where once you got to like towards the end, there were some enemies you could just swing down in 1 or 2 hits, which was just amazing. Yeah, it just ticked every box for me. For me as well, one of my favorite like sort of quests or missions or levels of any game ever, which is the Bargate prison, where basically you're put in prison for a couple of years, and like you're stuck in there trying to think of how you're going to get out. In the meantime, you've got to do this race with the other inmates for like the warden's birthday. And it's just again the way they did that was just so cool. I thought it was really well done.
Yeah, well, I just think the way that mission also ties into the systems that the game already put in place. So the fact that your character like physically ages over time.
Yeah.
So you go into that prison like however old you are, like 40 years old. You come out at age 42, like visibly older.
Yeah.
Like it's just fantastic. I said it during my number 4 slot, but it's one of the few games where there's systems that have been in place there that should 100% be adapted to more modern games, and I have yet to see them pulled off in the same way.
Yeah, but it's just a shame, I think, on later games where they sort of over-promised and maybe under-delivered in terms of the promises. It was a bit of a shame that it went that way, because they did have a real potential to take this, a long, long way. But, whatever happened later, nothing can take away from just, in my opinion, just how well like Lost Chapters especially were or was. Sorry, I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, I completely agree. Definitely deserving of a top 5.
Okay, so how about your number 2?
Okay, my number 2. I think once you get to this point in the list, my number 1 and number 2. I mean, my number 2 and everything before it in the list are fairly close.
Yep.
So I'll leave number 1 for now, but number 2 I think is as you were just talking about the Elder Scrolls, I decided to give this one to the Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim. I think it's kind of undeniable the effect that Skyrim has had on the gaming world since it came out in 2011. It's completely changed a lot of the gaming landscape. Some for good, some for bad, but mostly for good, I'd say. There's not much I could say about Skyrim that people haven't already heard. It's quite it's a very, very popular game. Everybody knew it would be on this list somewhere, I think. But a few things to talk about. The map, just absolutely fantastic. The lore that the Elder Scrolls has been building since, Daggerfall and all those older games is absolutely amazing as well. I think Skyrim does a really good job at least making the story quite accessible. If you haven't played the older games, I have played Oblivion. Not all of it, but I've played quite a lot of Oblivion. So I knew a lot of the backstory already, but it's Skyrim. You can just jump in, as a lot of people. Skyrim is their first game in the Elder Scrolls series, and it doesn't make you feel like you need to have played the other ones to learn what's going on in Skyrim. It's definitely a separate title, even though it's part of a series.
Yeah.
I think the magic system is probably the best I've seen in an RPG game. Like I think the magic's probably my favorite part of the game, just swapping between the different spells and absolutely obliterating everybody without even, drawing a sword. That sort of leads me to the only downside of this game, and probably the biggest reason why it's not on the number 1 slot. And that is just the basic melee combat. I think that it's probably some of the weakest I've seen in recent years. It's very, I don't know, it's just not very impactful. There isn't really you just sort of swing. And it makes the game a lot more fun when you get when you just pick like a 2-handed weapon and just swing once and they go down like instantly. But if you're using something smaller like a dagger or like a sword, you'll swing a few times and they'll just keep walking, and I don't know, it sort of brings you out of it a little bit, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
But by no means does it completely ruin the game for me. But I can definitely see that as the weakest point.
Yeah, I think that was a sticking point for me, and you'll see it won't be on my list at all. And one of the reasons being that, for me, I don't see, I don't think it does necessarily detract from the game overall. But when you're in a melee combat situation, and, you don't see opponents stagger, for example, or enemies stagger when you hit them with like this big blow that's taken out half of their health in once, but they're still just swinging at you. It's sometimes a bit frustrating. And I think as a sort of combat mechanism, they haven't really updated it for quite a long time.
No, they haven't. It's the same as it's been since like Morrowind, pretty much, or
much,
earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, also it was exactly the same one as in Oblivion. And this is the other thing is in both games, for example, you could go to first person or third person.
Yeah.
And I think that actually first person is probably the best way to experience those games for a couple of reasons. The first one being, this is more Oblivion and Skyrim for me, but like it's just the graphic of your character like riding a horse in third person just looks weird. It looks weird.
Does, yeah.
It wasn't worked out well, and also I think it makes the combat a little bit better doing it in first person as well. So like for me, like we're obviously a couple of Norse characters, so there's a reason why our lists are so filled with Norse like games.
It's like God of War got top 5, I'd say.
Yeah, without a doubt. But I think I can see Skyrim. I can see why Skyrim is up there. It's no doubt its effect on the industry is lasting even to now. There's a game that I'm about to mention as my number 2, and it's actually a game that a lot of people mention in the same breath as Skyrim. And that goes a long, long way. I think to saying what Skyrim's sort of influence has been. And with that segue, my number 2 is The Witcher 3. And I'll get onto The Witcher 3 in a second. I just want to say one last thing about Skyrim is that, when that game came out, it was the first time I'd actually seen in my life people that were basically, I would call them like FIFA, GTA, Call of Duty players only. So not hardcore gamers, but ones that would play those kinds of games were buying Skyrim and talking about Skyrim. And it was amazing to see, RPGs getting such that mainstream attention, basically. It was really great to see. And, I think that it's been a long time since, that they sort of stuffed up a few things since then, with Elder Scrolls Online not going perfectly and, a few other things.
Fallout 76, just to mention a few things, yeah.
But I think that nobody wants them like to fail or to keep doing this. Everybody wants a great follow-up. That's what we want.
And with the Elder Scrolls 6 announced, I think a lot of people are getting nervous after what Bethesda have been pulling recently. So hopefully they return to form.
Yeah, so yeah, I think so. And so fingers crossed that they do. Anyway, so The Witcher 3 is my number 2 pick for a few reasons. It was sort of chance that I came onto this series at all. I'm not I didn't know much about like Polish law, for example, and tradition. I didn't know about the books as most people wouldn't have done in the West, in the English-speaking world beforehand. And I got onto The Witcher 2 because it had, ported onto Xbox 360, and basically ended up playing it and absolutely loving it. I just was completely immersed in this sort of slightly more linear RPG style game. And so when the way it ended, you knew there was going to be a third one. You knew it. I was looking forward to it for 3-4 years until it did come out. Eventually I got it, and it was so much more advanced in terms of leveling up and map and everything than The Witcher 2. And I did struggle with it at first. Maybe I didn't put in the right time, or there's something that was missing. I knew it was going to be amazing, but I had to put it down for a while. And then when I came back to it, I really started to see how amazing it truly was. Graphically, it's a game that came out 3 years ago now, 4 years ago almost, and it's still almost as good as anything that's coming out now. Combat-wise, I think there's a lot of people criticize the combat, but I don't see a problem with it. I think it's amazing combat. It does exactly what it needs to do. The way you mix up these like signs or otherwise, sort of magic, if you like, and the melee combat, the way you sort of prepare for some monsters, for example, by using different potions or oils or whatever you want to do, is really well done. As a story, it's really great, and it's really simple at the same time. Like it's not this sort of interwoven, although there is politics in this world, it's not like an interwoven complex layer of narrative. It's just like your adoptive daughter is being chased by these like really fucking evil, I don't know if we're swearing, maybe I have to cut that out, but these really evil like elves, and you've got to try and first of all find her before they do. And then once you do that, you've got to try and protect her from them, which is really, really good. And they put a little bit of politics in there, but it's not enough to detract from the main arc of the story. It's just sort of extra to flesh it out. And another one where the soundtrack is fantastic. I mean, one of my favorite soundtrack, if you like, tracks or whatever of any game ever is the music in with the crones of Crookback Bog.
Yeah, the Witcher 3 soundtrack is incredible. It's it's so perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it successfully does what it needs to do, which is creep you out this particular part. And I have to say, I've listened to it again, without playing the game, and it's still just as creepy. I think it's fantastic. And then in terms of choices, like these feel like they're mostly choices that do affect things. Whether you are good in certain situations, whether you just want like your money for doing stuff without caring about the person's situation and this, that, and the other. Like it really does change like where you get to in the end. Like for me, for example, like I killed Letho in the second game, which is this other Witcher, and so I had one less person to help in a mission later on in the game, where it would have been really great to have had somebody of his stature to be able to help in that fight. So you really do feel the effects of it. And I think that, for that reason, it would have made number one, but for the one that's at number one, for me, I just think it's absolutely amazing. And then just to top it all off, the 2 DLCs, this Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, gives you an extra 20 to 30 hours plus, each, which is really what DLCs should be about, in my opinion. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I think that there's some of the few that they don't just, they're not just DLCs for the sake of it. They're obviously planned plot lines. Like, for example, the Hearts of Stone, the main sort of, I guess, antagonist of that DLC, you meet him in the base game right near the start, and he's just one of the few. He's kind of a negligible character at that point. He sort of just gives you some advice and leaves. nothing really suspicious. But then, you know, you see him later on in the DLC, and it's like, yeah, okay, this guy was, you know, they had a plan. They had a plan to do with this guy, and it's interesting.
Yeah, and like I've seen some videos from some other YouTubers that have actually highlighted, you know, like each scene that this guy shows up in. You know, 'cause it's more than just that one from the start, apparently, as well.
Really?
But it's one of those things that each time you're not going to notice it unless you're looking for it and have done this DLC. So it's one of those games that then encourages, you know, new game plus or a new playthrough from the start. And it's amazing that when you start doing that, what you actually see. And yeah, he showed up in several situations in the past, usually just hanging around, not quite in the foreground of those situations.
Right. I didn't even know that. I just knew that he was in that like first scene in the in like the White Orchid like inn.
Yeah.
I didn't realize he he showed up again. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really well tied in, and you know, this is a game that obviously everyone wants to see. This is the other thing, just to just to sort of, you know, for me to wrap up in terms of what I want to say about The Witcher is this actually sent me to other mediums, and you know, I've now that the original Polish books have been translated, I'm actually reading through the books as well and absolutely loving this world.
Yeah.
You know, now to me it feels like this world where okay, it helps that I'm reading the books and I've got now my image of what some of these characters look like from the games, which may be different to the books, but you know, I've still got what it looks like in my head. But it's now it's like a world that to me feels as well fleshed out, if not better, than some of the you know, great sort of even fantasy worlds that we've had in terms of films and books in the past. You know, I'm talking, you know, I'm not saying that the guy is a better writer than Tolkien, for example, for Lord of the Rings, but we're talking about a world that, you know, could be somewhere not far off. We're talking a world that is as fleshed out as, say, the Harry Potter universe. You know, and for me to have that enjoyment from just this game and these, well, particularly these two, I never played the first, but you know, from these two and specifically this one, to go into then, you know, reading these 12 or whatever books it is, I'm really pleased, and you know, it's an amazingly influential game or game series for me, without a doubt. I love it.
Yeah, I can't disagree at all. I think it's one of, as you'll see in a moment, if we move on to the number ones, my number one is the same game that we've just been talking about, Witcher 3. It's undeniable the effect it's had. You know, Skyrim is one of the games that was you know, on my number 2 slot for many reasons brought it back, whereas I think The Witcher 3 kind of just fixes everything that I had problems with in Skyrim and just keeps going.
Yep.
Like Skyrim sort of set a bar, and then The Witcher just kind of knocked that bar all the way up, like double. There's a huge gap, I think, between my number 2 and my number 1 here.
Yeah.
Witcher 3, pretty much every system is, you know, it's in depth enough that, you know, by the end of the game you'll have learnt it and you feel like you have a good understanding of it, but it's not so complicated that, you know, by the end of the game you never understand how to, you know, how to mutate your Witcher genes or whatever, or how to get the most out of your damage, or you know, how to spec your class so that you can be doing more damage with certain signs. It's very easy to understand, but slightly more difficult to master, but it's not overly complicated. I think the same can be said for every system in the game. So, you know, including like the ability to just look into the bestiary after you've killed a certain type of monster and see what it's weak to. You know, a little description on what sort of stuff it does, where you might be able to find them. It just lets you sink yourself into the lore of the world that it's created. You can really just, you know, follow a Witcher contract from a small town, and just as soon as you have a little bit of a guess as to what the monster might be, you can hop into your bestiary and just read a few entries on what its weaknesses are, and you can plan ahead. You can get oil for your silver sword. You can, you know, swap to the sign that you might need, whatever it happens to be. It just really lets you sink into the game's world, and I genuinely just cannot see this game not making number 1 on my list personally.
Yeah. Look, I can agree with that too, and I think, you know, something that I didn't mention before when talking about it was something about when you get the you know, improved level or improved armor or you know, a higher ranked weapon, for example, and then when you go into your sort of your next quest or your next little battle, and you feel that little bit, you know, more of a a boss. For example, like now I've just got a sword that's worth 20 more, damage points. So, okay, next time you're like, okay, bring it on. Who wants some? And it just gives you that feeling really, really well, which is something that I quite like. There's a lot of RPGs out there, or not just RPGs, but there's a lot of games in general out there that you sort of stay with the same weapons. And like, for example, even God of War, love that game, but it's the same weapon, all the way through. You're just upgrading the same weapon, and whilst that's great, it's not like getting this whole new weapon and feeling like, wow, like I've
it's just the same two, like the axe and the chains.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm absolutely fine with that, and you can still upgrade those, and it still gives you a bit of that feeling of going, okay, what's next? But that with God of War, for example, the reason why you're upgrading is because the next thing you're taking on is going to be bigger. Whereas like with The Witcher, obviously sometimes it's like you're going to be taking on some of the same monsters, but instead of taking you 10 minutes of rolling around and, maybe even dying once or twice, you're just going to be able to sort of cut through them a bit easier, which I really like. But also, something that we didn't mention so far is the landscape and how different like each area is that they've got.
Yeah, going from like the swamp to like the Norse, like Skellige Islands.
Yeah. So Norse/Celtic, really. Is what they are.
That was both.
Yeah, which I really like. So obviously the English sort of voice actors are mostly from like Ireland, to give that sort of more Celtic feel. But basically, it's more of like that Viking/Norse style, and as such, like some of the lore from there is a bit different, to some of the lore on, say, the mainland. But going from Novigrad even to like Tucson and Beauclair, like how different they look.
Yeah, just the different cultures, like between the Northern Realms and like the Nilfgaardians or whatever. It's just it's the world just feels really like alive, I guess, is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I agree, and so this is one of the few games. There's games up there that obviously throughout series where they sort of bring back characters from previous games or even previous sort of canon, say fan fiction or non-game like fiction or media. And like The Witcher 3 does this, I think, perfectly, where you can still, like, for example, the character of Dijkstra, where you kind of know him from before, but you can still learn so much about him if you've never played or read or watched anything about The Witcher before, all from within The Witcher 3. It's just they really flesh out those side characters and that sort of underlying levels of politics, between obviously the war between the South and the North. It's really well done, and let's be real, like King Radovid, for example, whatever you choose to do with him, like he's obviously gone crazy and set up these witch hunters, and it's like this the really good extra layer of. I mean, how many fantasy games have we seen where there's someone that, it's where someone that's a leader of humans hates anyone that does magic or non-humans, like non-humans. Like it's been done, but it feels fresh and new the way they've done it with King Radovid and his witch hunters. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I just think as a last point on The Witcher, because we've talked about it for a little while now, but as a final point,
about 12 minutes.
Well, just as a final point to sort of round it off as my number one, it's the fact that it came out in, what was it, 2015, 2016?
2015, yeah.
2015, yeah, and it still to this day has kept the bar at its height. Like nothing has actually overtaken it, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people will agree. It's probably still the best RPG so far. And it's a good 4 years old now, so
yeah. So like I can't, like, I don't out and out disagree with that because it's number 2 on my list, but I guess to sort of follow on from that, my number 1 is Mass Effect 2. I also picked 2 as the best in the series, and I'll tell you why I think Mass Effect 2 is a better RPG, is because how many RPGs are set in a sci-fi setting?
Very few.
And how many of those that are set in a sci-fi setting are actually really good?
Probably even fewer.
Yeah. And then not only that, but how many of them tie into like such a big scale like story, and give you choices that, for example, and I know I'm speaking about Mass Effect 2 in particular, and the reason why is you can't take, like with some of the other games we mentioned, you can't take this game out of the context of the series as well. Or you can play it by itself, and it's still a great game, obviously. But don't. What I'm saying is, you need the context of the series as well.
Yeah, it's part of a trilogy. It's not. Yeah.
Yeah, and in this trilogy, you can make a choice in the first game that then comes back to either be good for you or bite you on the ass in the third game.
Yeah.
For example, like if you're nice, there's a character in the third one called General Orako, who's like a Turian, which is one of the alien species. He's a Turian, like general, and he was, when you first meet him in the first game, in like Cora's Den, like a little sort of seedy nightclub bar thing, and he's sort of coming to retirement. He's disillusioned with everything, and he's becoming a bit of an alcoholic. And you sort of have to kick him into gear to get him back, to work for CSEC, which is like the police for the Citadel. And like, depending on how you've gone about that, you then meet him again in the third game, and he's sort of blocking like arms trade for one of Arya's like gang men or whatever. And so you've got to try and convince him to either drop that or potentially even just sanction his murder. And if you did like right by him in the first game, it's a lot easier to convince him in the third game just to, forget about it and move on, so you can keep him alive and get what you want. But if you were a bit of a dick to him in the first one, he doesn't play ball, and basically the only way to really get what you want is either to go to this really hard mission or to basically just allow him to be killed. So like there's these really great little tie-ins that you don't think of it as much in, say, the first one, but it really does affect you come the third game. And, in Mass Effect 2, for example, which I think is the best in the series in terms of the combat, they really, in my opinion, fixed up. Like Mass Effect 3's combat's good too, but Mass Effect 2 was when they really incorporated it was ammo as opposed to overheating. There was cover system, which was actually pretty good overall. There was as you said before, there was a bigger squad, a squad that you really cared about. You were on the Normandy. You had this great concept of like this suicide mission, into this part of space that no one's ever gone to, let alone come back from, which is really cool. And you can see the inspiration that the Mass Effect trilogy has from other series. So, it's another thing that really opened me up to other sort of sci-fis that I'd not yet sort of watched or read, like the series Firefly, for example, which is one season and a movie, because the TV series got cancelled because it just didn't quite have the viewership, but it was amazing. And you've got this concept of like the collector's home world with all this like debris from ships and whatnot, and that actually is a feature from Firefly that comes up. So there's a lot of influence that it has from others, but that actually enhances it. And they've come up with this completely unique world. I just think the second one is the best in the series for so many reasons. And I think for me, it's probably the most fun and enjoyable RPG game to play, like full stop, in my opinion. So I don't think it takes much in terms of leveling up. It's a really simple system, but it works. And yeah, as I said, they've done it in a way that nobody else ever has in terms of a sci-fi setting.
Yeah, I have to agree. Obviously, it's not my number one, but it definitely made top 3 for me. So obviously, like the effect has still resonated with me. And there's just so many good things to say about this game. Like it's basically impossible to cover it in a video. About 5 other games as well.
Of course. Well, we do have some videos coming up on this series in general. For anyone that's watching, we've got a couple of videos that we'll be doing soon. So keep an eye open for that. So we'll be able to go more in depth into the world and to the lore and everything else. But just as my kind of, I guess one of my final points is that one of the reasons why, for example, Halo didn't make this list is because for me, Mass Effect ruined Halo for me. And what I mean by that is that Halo is this really good, obviously series of games set in this sort of space setting as a shooting game. But for me, it was like Mass Effect took a sort of similar concept, but turned it into an RPG and really ran with it. And it's like, if you want a good, just a shooting game that's set in space, looks good, Halo's your one. If you want a game that's a shooting game, but also is an RPG and a well fleshed out world and gives you freedom and great characters and great dialogue options and kind of everything, as well as being a shooting game, then Mass Effect is the game to go for.
Yeah, I think Mass Effect's probably the best example of a sci-fi universe done right. And yeah, that there's very little more to say about it. It's I agree with your pick as it putting it as the number one. I had a couple games obviously above it that were a bit more influential to me specifically, but I definitely still made that top three. Like, there's no denying.
Well, I guess on that, I mean, if we've got a couple more minutes, maybe we can do a couple of honourable mentions, sort of, because I can see there might be people watching this tearing their hair out and prepared to go into the comments and going, why didn't you put this in? Like, can't believe you'd put this in. I mean, let's first of all clarify that it is our favourite. We're not saying it's the best. But if we were to one day come back and say what are our top 5 best games of all time, it might look a little bit different. I mean, they might still have some of the same entries.
It'd be very similar, I think, yeah.
But there will be some differences. And, if we ever did that video, which I'm sure we will at some point, we'll sort of really go through what our criteria were. But I guess when we say favorite, what we mean is, which games, like, did we sort of get the most out of, play the most ourselves? Which games, sort of influenced us the most? And that's sort of what's really affected these picks. One of the reasons why I've got, say, Mass Effect 2 as number 1, as opposed to, say, number 3 or number 2 even, is because at the time of recording, there's only, that in terms of this it's not this generation anymore, but in terms of these last couple of generations, there's no other game that I've played through more times than this game. In terms of doing it differently every time and having fun with doing it differently every time. And even when I play through it, having sort of 4 different save files so that I can try one bit in a conversation. And if I didn't like the way it came out, I'll then reload the save file and then do it differently. There's no game that I've had more satisfaction with playing through that way, really, more than this one at this point. Now, Witcher 3, for example, might become that way because I've only played through it once. Again at the time of recording, so there's every chance that I'll do it again, and if we were to make this list in a couple of years, maybe there's different things in there, but it's at the time of recording, that's my favorite game. But let's do some honorable mentions. If you've got a couple that maybe you were really umming and ahhing, maybe we can appease some people in the comment section and give us some honorable mentions.
Yeah. Okay. So, like, first, I guess we'll start with any that you might have, because you've got a bit more of a background, I suppose, a bit more time behind you to add some. So
you're trying to call me a bit long in the tooth.
Yeah, a little bit, just a little.
Well, all right. So I've sort of alluded to a couple from earlier. I mean, like I mentioned, that Tomb Raider was very, very close to being my number 4 pick. And that's the original one. And again, I think that it was a game that changed the face of games. It was just, it was so iconic that they're still making movies and new games of it today. Yeah. And a lot of people might say that, for example, the Drake series, the Uncharted series, is one of their favorites. And that wouldn't be a thing if it wasn't for Tomb Raider as well. That's another one. So in terms of sort of rainy days, rainy weekends, trying to work out how to get out of a particular crypt, whilst random gorillas like coming at you, like it's fantastic. It's really, really good. So that was so close to being on my list. I mean, I've got a few others that I can talk about. I mean, I mentioned briefly as well the sort of Abe, the Oddworld games from PS1 as well. They were really influential to me when I was young. And I guess sticking with that era, which was a little bit before you in terms of PS1 era, I mean, I can mention Disney's Hercules as one that was
classic.
And I would play this game so much. It was one of my favorite, if not maybe after Toy Story. Hercules was probably my favorite and Lion King. Let's be real. It's probably my favorite 90s Disney sort of movie. I really loved it at the time. I think I was 7 years old when it came out, and the game came out at the same time, more or less, and it was a perfect movie tie-in for me. And then I guess going away from that first series, but staying with movie tie-ins and Spider-Man 2, it's actually something that anyone that knows me, and as you continue to go through this channel, you'll see the fact that I had a top 5 favorite games and no Spider-Man game got put on that list says about, for me, how hard I had to think about this, because, you know, Spider-Man he's my guy. And, you know, I thought Spider-Man 2 was, you know, of all the Spider-Man games, that was the game changer to be the first ones to do open world. You know, it really changed a lot of things for me. And it came out at a time where I still wasn't allowed to play, you know, Grand Theft Auto games. So it was kind of, you know, that was my Grand Theft Auto at the time, basically.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah, it really was. So that's, you know, that's something that I'd say. And from that same time, roughly, Tekken Tag Tournament, the first one, has to be an honorable mention.
Yeah, Tekken series as a whole is definitely an honorable mention for me. I guess 7 and Tekken Tag 2 are like the two that I've played the most. But yeah, like they didn't quite make the list, but they're definitely, like, if there was a top 5 like fighting games, 100% Tekken 7 at the top. Spoiler if I ever do that list.
Well, I mean, for me, like, tag tournaments in there. I mean, the one that really got me onto it was Tekken 2. I had that one. I played it a lot. Absolutely adored it. It's still to this day. I've got it on my PS3, and you know, have played it every now and then. But the original Tekken Tag Tournament, I think, is the most fun. It was the first time they just brought together basically all the characters that they'd done. It was obviously given as non-canon, so it gave them an excuse just to put everybody in. And you know, it was pretty much the first game that came out when PS2 came out as well. So it was like a new generation thing in terms of graphics and power. It was on another level to what we'd seen before with the PS1. And it was the introduction, of course, of one of my favorite game modes of all time, which is Tekken Bowl.
That even made it into Tekken 7, I think you saw. But yeah, it's still around today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't want to go overdo honorable mentions, so I'll quickly fly through maybe 3 or 4 more, just as
I've got a few as well, and then
yeah, I'll let you sort of say yours. So I'll say the original Assassin's Creed game. That would be my pick from the series. Well. Not necessarily because it was the best one of the series, because I think probably 2 or maybe even Brotherhood, for example, might have been technically better games. But the first one for being for taking something onto a completely new dimension, for, you know, it was just, again, I know there was Prince of Persia before that, and it was obviously made by the same people and heavily influenced, but it took that ball and ran with it. And I absolutely adored this game. And even graphically at the time, it was like nothing else we'd seen. And that, in terms of game year, I mean, like the original Gears of War, which was on my list, came out in that same year. And that was actually not long after the Xbox 360 came out. And up to that point at home, I mean, we had a PS2 and we had an Xbox of that same previous generation. And one of the things that settled whether we were going to get a PS3 at the time or an Xbox 360 was those 2 games. Yeah. So, yeah, like 2 very, very iconic, influential games. And then it's kind of going on from that. Like, I have to say, like, obviously, Grand Theft Auto. I mean, pick one. Doesn't matter which one, to be honest. It deserves a mention because of play, you know, just play value. I couldn't put it in my top 5. It wouldn't get in my top 5, but it does deserve a mention because I've poured some serious hours into that game over the years, and some of the games that you can sort of, like, you know, that you can play within that, in terms of, like, I remember GTA 4 with my friends. We would actually set like a marker on the other side of the island, and we would basically say that you had to, like, go in as straight a line as possible to that marker without turning more than, like, basically 60 degrees each way. So basically as straight as possible. Whether that means you have to try and find a way up and over a building or not, it doesn't matter. And if anyone sort of walked in front of you, like directly in front of you, or hit you with a car, you had to kill them. But you had to basically still do all of that and try and get to the marker without basically either being killed by the police or somebody else. And it was much harder than it sounds. You know, little in-games like that is something that GTA games really brought to the table, like not many other games have been able to. And then I think my final, like, honorable mention, just to bring us in a little bit, is probably The Last of Us. Just because in terms of, like, a storytelling game, like, there hadn't been many before that did what they did well. It was a zombie game, but they didn't really overdo the zombies. And it was a really good mix of sort of problem solving to get to places and sort of a bit of stealth, and, as I said, a really great story. So yeah, those are my honorable mentions, I think.
Yeah, I can agree with all of those. I'll quickly run through mine, just because I think the video is getting fairly long now.
It is.
But okay, so the first one that I was seriously considering swapping out for the number 5 slot was just any of the Dark Souls games, or Bloodborne, just any of the Souls series.
Okay.
Personally, like I just, as you know, as since they didn't make it to my top 5, that's got to speak for itself. But the reason why it didn't is just because while the games themselves are good, I think the main reason why they get a mention is just the fact that, like, the influence that they've had on more recent games. A lot of people are equating games to, you know, being like Dark Souls, or, you know, Souls-like. Like, it's basically spawned a genre of its own. Which is basically, like, you know, the hardcore, like, type games that are meant to be difficult. So I just think, yeah, simply because of the fact that they've almost spawned their own entire genre, they deserve a mention.
Yep.
The next one, kind of touched on by you, but like the Assassin's Creed original game, and maybe 2 as well, I think absolutely deserve a mention. I don't think they really deserve a top 5. I think they definitely make a top 10 though. Like I'm not sure if anything would beat them out. They definitely had a big influence. Obviously, the series has declined immensely in recent years, but those original games were absolutely fantastic. So I can't really deny their place. Next one, sort of similar to Mass Effect, but it's the Knights of the Old Republic game, both 1 and 2. Very similar mechanics to Mass Effect, very similar sort of squad system. Just the only real difference is you're a Jedi instead of a character in the Mass Effect universe. I think anybody who's a Star Wars fan, if you haven't played these games, like, play them. They're fantastic.
And I think even if you're not a particular Star Wars fan, it's a story that's not really, like, it's set in the same universe, but it's not with the same characters and.
No,
So even if you're not a Star Wars fan, but you don't mind the concept of, you know, the Force, and instead of swords, lightsabers, for example, but you know, you don't want it to be Star Wars, then I think that that is a game that's well worth it.
I completely agree. My next one, just as a quick run through, obviously Grand Theft Auto, specifically 5, I'd say, just because of the amount of time I've sunk into it, both offline and also online, just like with friends doing shit. It's just one of those games where even once you finish the story, it's really easy to just hop in and just play the game. Like, you can there's
no end to this game, basically.
Yeah, like you can do a lot of things. I don't think GTA really deserves a top 5, or even, I'm not sure if it'd even make a top 10 for me, but it's just one of those games that deserves a mention, I think, because of the amount of hours I put into it. And then the final one, which I'll talk about a little bit more, is Ni no Kuni, both 1 and 2. Specifically for me, I really enjoyed both of them. The Ghibli sort of art style with the, I think it's Level 5 Studio, I think is the developer, just perfectly blended it into the sort of game world, mixing between sort of playing the game and then cutscenes that are in that, like, Ghibli anime sort of style. Really enjoyed the story, the characters, just everything about it. It's a fantastic game. I think it would definitely make my top 10, but it didn't quite make the top 5. And the second game was also really good as well. Look, I never played the second one, but the first one I did, and it was fantastic. It really, you know, you could really feel like it wasn't just like an offshoot of like that sort of film studio. It was that film studio really working on making a great game. And it was almost like, for me, it's one that you add to the collection from that film studio. So it's like, you know, you have all the movies, and then you have this game which tells its own story that is just as much a part of that, you know, studio collection as the movies are. And so with that in mind, you know, for me, one of my absolute favorites as well. Didn't make the list because it was really hard to fit something in there. But it's sort of, once you get to those top 5s, it's a really, like, competitive spot for me. I find it, like, I definitely put some thought into it, and it doesn't quite make the top 5 for me, but it's still definitely deserving of a mention.
Absolutely. So there's actually, I don't want to labor the point, there's actually one that I didn't mention that I really should think that this studio deserves a mention before anyone goes nuts, and that's, I want to say, Heavy Rain. Just get that out there. Quantic, they make amazing pieces of art. The only reason why it wouldn't make my top 5, it might make my top 10, but the only reason why it wouldn't make my top 5 again, is because of competition, and also because it's not a game that's about gameplay as really about being this a different way of telling a story, and that's probably why it wouldn't make my top 5. But absolutely fantastic, and Quantic really do deserve a mention. So yeah, I just wanted to get that one in. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. I completely agree with that. That's fine. And that's basically the end of my honorable mentions. There's a lot I could go through.
Yeah.
But it's I'll leave it at that. Really, that's a decent amount of honorable mentions that deserve at least a name.
Well, if anyone's still with us in terms of viewers or listeners, we thank you for sticking around for so long during this. We really wanted to, first of all, we said to each other that we'd make really good meaty content as opposed to just quick clickbait content. So we hope that we've done that, even though it was a list. We also, I guess, wanted to do this video as a way to sort of for you guys to understand where we're coming from in terms of our gaming sort of backgrounds and likes and what has influence over us, so that you can maybe take that context into further videos that we do. But if you want any other more in-depth meaty content, keep an eye on our channel. If you disagree with things that we said and think we're absolutely crazy, please just let us know in the comments. And otherwise,
I'd love to see other people's lists and sort of compare them to mine and just see what influenced other people. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, let us know what your top 5 favorite games, and these are not best games. These are your favorite games. These are the games that have influenced you the most, and shaped the way you then played and bought games in after that. So yeah, let us know. And if there's any sort of video content that you want us to create as well, please let us know as well, and we'll love to look into that and see what we can do for you. Otherwise, the next video that we think will be coming out is a retrospective, not so retrospective, but sort of a look back on Mass Effect Andromeda and how it sits with us now that there's a bit more time removed from the initial feelings. And yeah, we'll be looking forward to seeing you on that one. Yep. Thank you for watching.
And until next time.
Bye.
Bye.